In the first half of the 13th century, whispers carried across the winds of the steppes. Stories told by merchants staggering into Europe from the east spoke of strange riders, men who seemed half human, half beast, with bows that could pierce armor and horses that never tired. They were said to descend upon cities like a storm, vanishing before dawn left the horizon red with fire. At first, these tales were dismissed as exaggerations spun by frightened traders, but soon the stories hardened into a truth that chilled the bones of all who heard them. The Mongols were coming. Europe at the time was not prepared for such a threat. Its kingdoms bickered endlessly, each prince and duke scheming against neighbors instead of uniting against a common enemy. To the west, the papacy was concerned with theological disputes and power struggles. To the east, the fragmented states of Poland and Hungary barely held their own against local rivals. No one imagined that from beyond the Carpathian Mountains would come a force so alien, so relentless, that even the proudest kings would tremble. The first rumors painted the Mongols as monsters born from the wilderness. Chroniclers described them as having faces like demons, broad and flat, with eyes that glowed with cruelty. They were called the Tartars, as if they had sprung from the depths of Tartarus itself. One cleric wrote in horror that these riders eat raw flesh and drink blood, their hearts colder than the stones of hell. Fear magnified them into legends. Some believed they were the biblical scourge Gog and Magog, unleashed at the end of days. Others whispered they were God's punishment for Europe's sins, a storm of horsemen sent to burn away pride and arrogance. But beyond the myths, there was truth. The Mongols moved with uncanny speed. Their armies, though thousands of miles away, could cover distances no European army could match. They carried no supply wagons, lived off the land, drank the blood of their own horses when necessary. Where a European knight lumbered in steel and needed acres of farmland to feed his mount, a Mongol warrior could ride for days without slowing. They were unlike anything Europe had ever faced. To the average villager in a medieval hamlet, however, the Mongols were more ghost story than reality. Life was already filled with hardship, tending fields, enduring hunger, fearing wolves in the forest, plague in the village, or tax collectors from the castle. The thought of horsemen from the edge of the world was as distant as the moon. But then, in the marketplaces of Krakow, in the ports of the Adriatic, and in the monasteries of Germany, news began to seep in like black ink on parchment. Cities far to the east had fallen. Entire populations were slaughtered. Towns that once traded with Europe were now smoldering ruins. The storm was real, and it was rolling westward. By the time the first frightened riders galloped into Poland, with tales of entire armies swept aside, the mood in Europe had shifted. No longer were the Mongols dismissed as myth. Panic began to bloom. Priests thundered from pulpits that Christendom was in peril, warning that God had unleashed this scourge upon sinful mankind. Kings sent desperate letters to the Pope, begging for guidance. For the first time in centuries, the West turned its gaze eastward with dread. Yet the terror was amplified not just by what was known, but by what was unknown. No one in Europe truly understood who these people were or what they wanted. They seemed to appear out of the endless horizon, destroy everything in their path, and vanish into silence. Chroniclers described them as riding with thunder, their arrows blotting out the sun. To terrified peasants, it was not war, it was the apocalypse. The shadow from the east was not simply an army, it was an idea. It was the idea that Europe was not the center of the world, that beyond its forests and cathedrals lay an empire more powerful, more ruthless, and more relentless than anything they could imagine. This realization struck deeper than swords ever could. And when the Mongols finally appeared at Europe's borders, that shadow became fire and blood. Long before the Mongols thundered into the consciousness of Europe, their story began on the vast windswept steppes of Central Asia. Here, in a world of endless grassland stretching beyond sight, survival was a relentless struggle. It was a land where winter could kill a man as surely as a sword, where rival clans fought over herds of horses and grazing lands, and where loyalty was fragile, shifting like sand in a storm. Out of this crucible of hardship arose a man destined to shape history. Temujin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan. Temujin's childhood was nothing like the princes and noble heirs of Europe. Born into a minor clan, his life was marked by betrayal and loss. His father was poisoned by rivals when Temujin was still a boy, leaving his family vulnerable and abandoned by their tribe. For a time, the young Temujin lived as an outcast, his family reduced to scavenging for roots and small animals. In these years of hunger and humiliation, he learned two vital truths that would shape his destiny: that alliances were more powerful than bloodlines, and that fear could break the strongest foe. As he grew, Temujin began to gather followers, not through noble heritage, but through charisma, loyalty, and ruthless determination. He rewarded merit rather than noble birth, offering power and position to any man who proved himself capable. This radical idea drew warriors to his banner from across the steppes. To the nomadic tribes, used to shifting leaders and fragile loyalties, Temujin's vision was unlike anything they had seen before. By uniting the fractious Mongol clans under one banner, he achieved what seemed impossible. Rivals who once raided one another's camps now rode together as brothers in arms. Out of this union, forged through blood and iron, Temujin declared himself Genghis Khan, universal ruler. And unlike Europe, divided by kings and dukes, squabbling over castles, the Mongols became a single, disciplined force with one clear goal: conquest. The Mongol army that Genghis Khan created was unlike any in the world. Each warrior was a master horseman, trained from childhood to ride at full speed while loosing arrows with deadly accuracy. They carried composite bows of horn and sinew, weapons that could pierce armor at incredible range. Discipline was absolute. If one man deserted, his entire unit could be executed. If a soldier captured plunder without permission, it was taken and redistributed. Every victory belonged to the horde, not the individual, but it was not merely discipline and horsemanship that made them terrifying. It was strategy. Genghis Khan understood deception better than any European commander of his age. He perfected the tactic of the feigned retreat. His warriors would scatter in apparent panic, luring enemies into pursuit, only to wheel around and unleash a storm of arrows. Again and again, this broke armies far larger than his own. Combined with ruthless speed and precise coordination, the Mongols could cover distances no enemy could anticipate, appearing in places they should not have been. At times they should not have been there. Beyond their skill in battle, the Mongols were masters of psychological warfare. They spread terror deliberately, leaving survivors to tell tales of slaughter so that the next city would surrender without resistance. In some campaigns, they massacred entire populations, not out of cruelty alone, but to engrave their name into memory. To resist was to invite annihilation. To submit was to live, at least temporarily. It was war as theater, every victory echoing beyond the battlefield. By the time Europe first heard their name, the Mongols had already conquered vast territories, the great cities of Central Asia, the Persian Khwarezmian Empire, and beyond. Their empire stretched from the Yellow Sea to the Caspian, a domain so vast that European maps could not capture its scale. To men in castles along the Rhine or in monasteries in France, it was incomprehensible. How could men who came from barren grasslands command the might of entire civilizations? Yet the Mongols were not merely destroyers. They built a network of roads, encouraged trade along the Silk Road, and carried knowledge across continents. In their empire, merchants found protection, messengers raced across lands with astonishing speed, and ideas traveled farther than ever before. But this was the dual nature of the horde: order within, terror without. By the early 13th century, Europe stood on the very edge of their expanding shadow. Most Europeans still did not realize it, but the Mongols were already probing the edges of their world. Scouts ventured westward, their eyes set upon lands rich and divided. For Genghis Khan, whose ambition knew no borders, Europe was not beyond reach. To him, it was simply the next horizon. And so, while kings in Europe squabbled over crowns and borders, while peasants tilled their fields in ignorance of distant storms, the greatest military machine in history gathered strength. The winds of the steppe were shifting, and soon they would blow west. The first true collision between the Mongols and medieval Europe came not with the thunder of a full invasion, but with a probing strike, a brutal taste of what was to come. The year was 1223, and Europe was blissfully ignorant of the storm gathering on its borders. The Mongols, under the command of Subutai and Genghis, two of Genghis Khan's most brilliant generals, had already swept through the Khwarezmian Empire in Persia, leaving shattered cities and broken armies in their wake. Instead of turning back east, they pressed farther, curious about the lands beyond the steppes. Determined to map the strength or weakness of these distant kingdoms, their scouts rode into the lands of the Kiev and Rus, a loose federation of principalities that sprawled across what is now Ukraine and Western Russia. Here, fractured princes ruled rival cities like Kyiv, Chernigov, and Vladimir. They were Orthodox Christians, proud and fierce, but like the kingdoms of Western Europe, they were divided by jealousy and mistrust. To Subutai and Genghis, this disunity was an open door. The Mongols moved with uncanny speed, raiding towns and scattering defenders. Word spread like wildfire. Strange horsemen had crossed the steppes, striking without warning, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. Terrified refugees poured into the cities of Rus, their talis filled with fire and slaughter. For the princes of Rus, this was intolerable. For centuries, they had fended off nomadic raiders from the steppes, Pechenegs, Cumans, Kipchaks. Surely, they thought, these new raiders were no different. If they united, they would crush them. So, a great coalition was formed. Princes from across the land, supported by steppe allies like the Cumans, assembled a vast army, perhaps 80,000 strong, though the numbers remain uncertain. It was a force far larger than the Mongols' 20,000 riders. The princes were confident. They were fighting on their own soil, defending Christendom against pagan invaders. How could they lose? The two armies met on the banks of the Kalka River. In May of 1223, the Mongols, masters of deception, lured the coalition into a trap. Subutai and Genghis pretended to flee in panic, their forces retreating across the plains. The Rus, convinced of victory, gave chase. But the pursuit stretched on for days, wearing down men and horses. Discipline faltered. Units scattered in the desperate race to strike a fleeing foe. And then, at the chosen moment, the Mongols wheeled around. Their retreat was an illusion, a carefully planned snare. As the exhausted coalition blundered forward, the Mongols encircled them, unleashing storms of arrows that shredded armor and sowed chaos. Panic spread. The great coalition, assembled with so much pride and hope, dissolved into disaster. Thousands of men were cut down on the open field. The princes fled in disarray. Those who survived the slaughter faced an even darker fate. Mstislav of Kiev and other captured leaders were promised safety if they surrendered. Instead, the Mongols executed them in a manner both symbolic and terrifying. They placed the princes beneath wooden planks, then held a victory feast on top of them. As the Mongol commanders and their men celebrated, the life of the princes was crushed out beneath their weight. It was a message written in cruelty. Resistance would not only bring defeat, but humiliation and annihilation. That when word of the disaster spread across Rus, fear gripped the land. Whole cities trembled at the thought of these strange riders, who fought with such cunning and brutality. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the Mongols withdrew. They rode back across the steppes, vanishing into the east like ghosts. Europe breathed a sigh of relief. Perhaps, some thought, the threat had passed, no different from the raids of nomadic tribes that had come before. Yet others knew better. The scale of the defeat at Khalkha was unlike anything the Rus had suffered. The Mongols had not come merely to raid and plunder. They had come to test, to measure the strength of the Western lands. And what they found was weakness. For nearly 2 decades, Europe would see little of the Mongols again. But the memory of Khalkha lingered like a wound, a whisper carried in chronicles and sermons. The horsemen from the east had shown their power and then disappeared. To the west, rulers forgot. But to the Mongols, it was only the beginning. When they returned, it would not be with 20,000 men testing their strength. It would be with the full fury of the horde. 18 years after the calamity at the Khalkha River, Europe had nearly forgotten the Mongols. The princes of Rus still bore the scars of that defeat, but to the kings and nobles farther west, it was a distant story, almost a legend told by travelers. Surely, they thought, such a disaster could never strike the heart of Christendom. Yet in 1241, the storm returned, no longer a probing raid, but a full invasion led by some of the greatest commanders in Mongol history, Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, and Subutai, the old general who had crushed armies from China to Persia. This time, their target was not only the divided lands of Rus, but Poland, Hungary, and beyond that. The invasion began with precision. In the winter of 1240, the Mongols descended on Kyiv, the great city of the Rus. Its walls crumbled under siege engines, its streets ran red, and its golden domes were blackened with smoke. What had once been a jewel of Eastern Europe was reduced to ashes. From there, the Mongols swept west, splitting their forces in a campaign of terror designed to strike multiple kingdoms at once. One army moved north into Poland, their path marked by fire and ruin. The Poles scrambled to resist, calling knights from Silesia, Bohemia, and the Teutonic Order. At the city of Liegnitz in April 1241, a coalition of European knights assembled under Duke Henry the Pious. Clad in heavy armor, banners flying, they marched out to meet the invaders with confidence born of faith and tradition. To the knights, warfare was an affair of honor and brute courage. To the Mongols, it was a game of deception and precision. The clash at Liegnitz was brutal and swift. The Mongols feigned retreat, as they had at Khalkha, drawing the knights into chaos. Clouds of arrows rained down, cutting through armor, unhorsing men before they could even close in for battle. Then, as the knights faltered, the Mongols counterattacked with deadly efficiency. Duke Henry fell in the fighting, his army shattered. After the battle, legend says the Mongols paraded his severed head before the walls of Liegnitz to terrify the defenders. Poland lay open, and its cities burned one after another. Meanwhile, the main Mongol host struck south into Hungary. King Bela IV, desperate to save his kingdom, summoned nobles, knights, and peasants alike. By March of 1241, he had gathered perhaps 100,000 men, a massive force by European standards. Yet it was an army plagued by disunity, quarrels between nobles, and poor coordination. The Mongols, disciplined and led by the genius of Subutai, waited for the perfect moment. That moment came on April 11th. At the Sayo River, near the village of Mohi, the Hungarian camp sprawled across the plain, defended by wooden barricades. By night, Mongol engineers crossed the river in silence, setting traps and preparing ambushes. At dawn they struck. Mongol cavalry stormed the barricades, while others encircled the camp. Panic erupted. Thousands of Hungarians, trapped against the river, were cut down as arrows rained upon them. Horses stampeded, knights drowned, peasants were slaughtered without mercy. It was not a battle, it was annihilation. When the smoke cleared, Hungary was broken. Cities fell one by one, their populations massacred or enslaved. The Mongols moved with terrifying speed, riding across the Plains burning, killing, leaving entire regions desolate. Chroniclers describe villages so silent that not even a dog barked. Refugees fled west, pouring into Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, carrying with them tales of horror. To Europeans who had doubted, it was now undeniable. An enemy had come unlike any they had ever known. For a brief moment, it seemed all of Christendom might fall. Poland lay in ruins. Hungary was devastated. The Mongols stood poised at the very heart of Europe. Their path opened toward Vienna, perhaps even Rome. Panic swept the continent. Monks preached that the apocalypse was at hand, kings prepared for the worst, and peasants whispered that the horsemen were demons sent by God's wrath. And then suddenly, the Mongols vanished just as the terror reached its peak. Word came that Genghis Khan, ruler of the Mongol Empire, had died far away in Karakorum. By tradition, the princes of Genghis line were required to return home to elect a new great Khan. So, at the very moment Europe stood on the brink of destruction, Batu and Subutai withdrew their armies and rode east. Like a storm breaking apart in mid-air, the invasion ended as suddenly as it had begun. Europe was spared, but not saved. For the people who lived through those months of fire and ruin, the scars would never fade. The Mongols had shown that no fortress, no army, no kingdom was safe. And even in their absence, the terror of their return lingered like a shadow across the continent. If Europe thought the Mongols were simply another barbarian horde, they were gravely mistaken. The Mongols were not reckless raiders, but masters of deliberate strategy, combining speed, discipline, and terror into a weapon more devastating than any sword. Their true genius lay not only in the clash of arms, but in how they manipulated fear itself, turning it into a weapon that preceded their armies long before the first hoof struck the ground. Unlike the armored knights of Europe, who fought for glory, honor, and ransom, the Mongols fought to annihilate resistance. When they approached a city, they often gave a chilling ultimatum: surrender peacefully and pay tribute, or resist and face utter destruction. Those who yielded were often spared, at least temporarily. Their lands folded into the Mongol domain, with local rulers left in place as vassals. But if a city defied them, the consequences were merciless. Walls were torn down, populations slaughtered or enslaved, and the ruins left smoldering as a warning. Survivors were deliberately allowed to escape, not out of mercy, but so they could spread tales of horror to the next town. This method was not born from cruelty alone, but from strategy. Fear was the cheapest weapon in their arsenal. If the enemy surrendered before a single arrow was loosed, the Mongols conserved their strength, their horses, and their supplies. If terror alone could make kings bend the knee, then the empire grew without wasting blood. It was psychological warfare at a scale Europe had never seen. Equally terrifying was their use of deception on the battlefield. Subutai, the Mongol general whose name became legend, perfected the art of the feigned retreat. Time and again, European knights trained to charge recklessly into battle with valor fell victim to this trick. The Mongols would pretend to break ranks and scatter in panic, luring their enemies into pursuit. But the retreat was an illusion. Once the knights were drawn out, disorganized and overextended, the Mongol cavalry would wheel around, encircle them, and unleash devastating volleys of arrows. By the time the knights realized the trap, it was too late. Whole armies were broken this way. Their composite bows were deadly instruments, able to pierce armor at distances European archers could only dream of. Each warrior carried multiple bows and quivers filled with arrows, barbed, piercing, even fire-tipped, designed for different purposes. Unlike knights who relied on close combat, the Mongols killed from afar, reducing their own casualties while sowing chaos. Against heavily armored opponents, they harried them until exhaustion, striking with speed, then vanishing before the enemy could respond. Beyond the battlefield, the Mongols were masters of intelligence. They did not ride blindly into foreign lands. Scouts mapped every river, mountain, and road. Spies infiltrated towns, gathering knowledge about defenses, supplies, and alliances. Merchants traveling through Europe often carried back news to Mongol ears. By the time an army marched, its generals knew the land as if they had lived there. Subutai himself was said to plan campaigns years in advance, coordinating multiple armies across vast distances with astonishing precision. Even their logistics were revolutionary. The Mongols could ride farther and faster than any army in Europe. Because of their use of relay stations, small outposts where fresh horses were kept ready, messages could travel hundreds of miles in days. Entire armies could coordinate movements across thousands of miles of terrain. To their enemies, it seemed like sorcery. How could armies separated by mountain ranges strike as if moving with one mind? But perhaps the most haunting element of their tactics was their indifference to time. Europeans fought wars bound by seasons, campaigns halted in winter, armies disbanded for harvest. The Mongols knew no such limits. They rode in blizzards, through floods, across frozen rivers. No season shielded a kingdom from their wrath. To peasants and nobles alike, it seemed the Mongols were everywhere, unstoppable, an inhuman force beyond comprehension. To resist them was to invite annihilation. To yield was to live under the shadow of tribute, forever fearing that the horsemen might return. This was the terror the Mongols crafted with deliberate care. Not simply the defeat of an army, but the breaking of a people's will. It was not war as Europe knew it. It was war elevated into something colder, sharper, and far more terrifying. And yet, just as the Mongols seemed ready to crush Christendom entirely, the invasion stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The horsemen turned their backs, riding east, leaving behind smoking ruins and trembling survivors. Europe was spared not by its own strength, but by fate, a death in distant Karakoram that pulled the horde away. But for those who lived through it, the terror remained. For decades after, villagers still whispered of riders who could not be stopped. Kings remembered the humiliation of shattered armies, and priests warned that the punishment of God could always return from the steppes. The tactics of the Mongols had not only destroyed kingdoms, they had left scars on the European soul. The year was 1242, and Europe stood on the edge of disaster. Poland had been crushed, Hungary devastated, its fields blackened and villages silent. Refugees staggered into Austria, Bohemia, and the Holy Roman Empire, with stories so dreadful that many dismissed them as madness, of horsemen who could ride for days without rest, of arrows that pierced armor, of entire cities reduced to ash. Europe braced itself for the final blow. Vienna was next. Beyond it lay the beating heart of Christendom, Rome itself. And then, the storm vanished. Without warning, the Mongols withdrew. Their armies melted back across the plains, leaving smoldering ruins behind them, but sparing the kingdoms that had prepared to die. To Europeans, it was as if the hand of God had intervened. Chroniclers celebrated it as a miracle. Priests declared that fervent prayers had turned back the apocalypse. Kings who only weeks earlier had despaired now claimed deliverance by divine providence. But the truth was far more complex and far more unsettling. At the heart of this retreat was the death of Genghis Khan, son of Genghis and ruler of the Mongol Empire. Thousands of miles away, in distant Karakoram, news arrived in the winter of 1241. Genghis was dead, and a new great Khan had to be chosen. By custom and law, every prince of the Genghis line was required to return to the steppe to participate in the Kurultai, the great council that would elect his successor. For Beta Khan, who commanded the western campaign, and Subutai, the mastermind of the invasion, this meant a choice between continuing the conquest of Europe and fulfilling their dynastic duty. They turned east. And so the withdrawal began. It was not chaotic, nor a desperate flight. It was deliberate, calculated, and terrifyingly organized. Europe, which had expected one last onslaught, instead watched as the horde vanished like mist. Their camps emptied, their banners disappeared, and their hoofprints faded into the plains. It was not Europe's armies that saved Christendom, nor its castles or kings. It was the politics of a distant empire, a stroke of fate. Yet this explanation alone has never satisfied historians. For centuries, scholars and chroniclers alike have asked, if Geday's death called them home, why did the Mongols never return in full force? Europe was fractured, vulnerable, ripe for conquest. Why stop when victory was within reach? Some argue geography played its part. The plains of Hungary suited Mongol cavalry, but beyond lay mountains, forests, and rivers that blunted their speed. The further west they pushed, the more difficult it became to feed their horses and sustain their armies. Unlike the open steppe, Europe's landscape was a maze of stone castles and walled cities. For the first time, perhaps, the Mongols faced a land not easily devoured. Others point to logistics. The further they advanced, the thinner their supply lines stretched. Despite their skill at living off the land, Europe was not a limitless plain. Its dense forests and scattered farmlands could not sustain an army that numbered in the tens of thousands, each warrior with multiple horses. Subutai may have recognized that pushing deeper into Europe risked overextension, the one danger the Mongols always avoided. Another theory whispers of strategy. Perhaps Europe had never been the ultimate goal. The Mongols had conquered Rus and shattered Hungary, securing the eastern frontier of Europe. Their true interest may have been southward, toward the rich empires of the Islamic world, or further, into China. Europe, broken and terrified, was left to stew in its own fear. A psychological victory as valuable as any battlefield triumph. Whatever the reason, the effect was the same. Europe had been spared. But spared did not mean safe. Kings knew the retreat was not their doing. Knights who had boasted of courage now lived with the shame of knowing they had been powerless. Peasants whispered at night that the riders would return, that perhaps they were only gathering strength beyond the horizon. For decades, Europe lived in the shadow of that retreat. Every rumor of riders on the steppes, every faint echo of hooves, rekindled the fear. Even the mightiest rulers carried the memory of how close they had come to annihilation. The Mongols had shown that Europe's castles and crowns meant nothing before the storm. And so, the retreat of 1242 became one of history's great mysteries, a moment when the fate of Christendom hung by a thread, saved not by valor or victory, but by the distant death of a Khan. Europe survived, but it knew survival was fragile, a gift given by chance, not strength. The terror did not vanish with the Mongols. It lingered, shaping policies, sermons, and dreams. For even in absence, the Mongols haunted Europe still. Europe in 1242 was not a land of triumph, but of survivors. Though the Mongols had turned east, they left behind more than smoldering towns and ruined fields. They left a scar carved into the imagination of Christendom. Never before had Europe faced an enemy that seemed so invincible, so merciless, and so alien. The retreat did not feel like victory. It felt like a reprieve before judgment returned. In Hungary, the devastation was almost beyond comprehension. Chroniclers recorded villages so empty that not even a dog barked. Entire regions were depopulated, their farmlands abandoned. King Bila IV, who had fled in the chaos of Mohi, returned to a broken kingdom. His reputation was stained, yet he understood the lesson better than most. Hungary could not survive another invasion unprepared. He began rebuilding fortifications in stone, ordering the construction of castles and walled towns that might resist Mongol siege engines. He invited settlers from abroad to repopulate the land, knowing that without human hands to work the soil, Hungary would starve. His reign became one long preparation for a return that many feared was inevitable. In Poland, the memory of Liegnitz lingered as a wound. The death of Duke Henry the Pious became legend, his sacrifice remembered as a warning of what Europe faced. The Teutonic Knights, who had joined the fight, redoubled their presence in the region, but even their iron discipline could not erase the truth. Christian knights had been humbled by an enemy who fought with cunning rather than chivalry. Farther west, where the Mongol hooves had not yet fallen, fear spread like wildfire. In Vienna, in Paris, even in Rome, rulers whispered about the apocalypse. Priests thundered from pulpits that the Mongols were Gog and Magog, the monstrous nations foretold in the Book of Revelation, unleashed as a sign that the end of days was near. The terror was not only military, it was spiritual. If these riders were not merely men, but agents of divine wrath, what hope could mortal armies have? Pope Innocent IV understood both the danger and the opportunity. In 1245, at the Council of Lyon, he called for urgent action, not a crusade of swords, but of words. Europe needed to understand these horsemen, to learn their intentions, perhaps even to turn them toward alliance. Envoys were dispatched eastward, men like Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, a Franciscan friar who journeyed all the way to Karakorum, the Mongol capital. He carried letters imploring the Mongols to embrace Christianity and cease their wars. The reply he brought back was chilling. The great Khan demanded that the Pope himself submit, for the Mongols were destined to rule the world. Other missions followed. William of Rubruck, another friar, traveled deep into Mongol lands, marveling at the empire's order, its couriers, its wealth. His accounts revealed both fascination and dread. To the Europeans who read his words, the Mongols were no longer faceless demons, but a civilization in their own right, disciplined, sophisticated, and still terrifyingly powerful. Meanwhile, kings across Europe took desperate measures. Alliances were proposed, fortifications strengthened, armies drilled. Yet beneath the bravado lay a gnawing truth. No matter what they built or how they prayed, if the Mongols returned in force, nothing could stop them. Every rumor of horsemen on the steppes sent shivers through courts and villages alike. When merchants spoke of movements in the east, when envoys returned with tales of vast armies gathering, Europe listened with bated breath. The terror of 1241 became a living memory, passed from one generation to the next. Mothers frightened children into obedience by whispering about the Tatars. Chronicles recorded the horror with a mixture of awe and fear, as if to remind future readers that Europe had once stood on the brink of annihilation. The Mongols had shown that Christendom was not invulnerable, that its castles and crowns were fragile things in the face of an empire that spanned continents. And so, the echo of fear shaped Europe long after the hooves had faded. It hardened. Kings inspired diplomacy and haunted sermons. Even in their absence, the Mongols became a permanent presence in the European imagination, an ever-looming shadow from the east, always threatening to return. Though Europe had seen the Mongols only as a scourge, a force of fire and blood, the decades after 1241 revealed a different dimension, the uneasy dance of diplomacy. For the rulers of Christendom, the terror of invasion did not end when the horsemen withdrew. Instead, it transformed into an obsession: how to understand these people, how to appease them, perhaps even how to bend them into allies. And so began one of the strangest episodes of medieval history, the clash not of armies, but of cultures. It started with the Church. Pope Innocent IV, realizing that fear alone could not hold the Mongols at bay, sent envoys eastward. The first, Giovanni da Pian del Carpini, was no warrior but a Franciscan friar, 60 years old, who embarked in 1245 on a perilous journey across the steppes. His mission: to deliver a letter imploring the Mongols to cease their attacks and convert to Christianity. His trek was grueling: months on horseback through snow and wind, through lands where every horizon seemed endless and empty. But at last, he reached the Mongol court, and then the capital of Karakorum itself. What he saw shocked him. Instead of savages, Carpini encountered an empire of order and precision. Roads stretched across continents, guarded by outposts. Messengers on fresh. Horses could deliver news faster than any kingdom in Europe. The Khan's court was a spectacle of power, filled with ambassadors from across Asia, craftsmen from China, merchants from Persia. Carpane's report to the Pope was filled with awe and dread. The Mongols were not a rabble, but a disciplined civilization, perhaps stronger than any Christian kingdom. Their reply was even more unsettling. The great Khan demanded submission. If Europe wished peace, it must bow, for heaven had granted the Mongols dominion over all the earth. Other missions followed. In 1253, another Franciscan, William of Rubruck, traveled deep into Mongol lands under the blessing of King Louis IX of France. His journey took him to the camp of Mongol Khan, successor of Gidai. Rubruck's account is one of the most vivid portraits we possess of Mongol life. He described yurts vast as palaces, feasts where fermented mare's milk flowed, shamans chanting by firelight, and the Khan's court filled with a babel of languages. He marveled at how the Mongols could destroy one city, yet protect merchants across thousands of miles, creating a web of trade that linked Europe to China. Yet beneath his fascination lay unease. The Khan listened politely to Rubruck's words of Christ, but dismissed them. To the Mongols, all religions were tolerated. But none rivaled their destiny. Conquest. Europeans were fascinated and horrified in equal measure. For the first time, they began to glimpse the world beyond their narrow kingdoms. Through these missions, knowledge trickled back. Maps of distant lands, rumors of silk and spices, strange tales of exotic peoples. The Mongols, in their paradoxical way, became both destroyers and conduits of connection. They terrified Europe, yet they also opened its eyes. Meanwhile, some rulers saw opportunity where others saw only doom. The kings of France and the Holy Roman Empire dreamed of alliances with the Mongols against their common enemy, the rising power of Islam. Letters were exchanged, envoys dispatched. At times, the idea of a Franco-Mongol alliance seemed within reach, a vision of Christendom and the Khans marching side by side against the Caliphate. But it was a mirage. The Mongols had no interest in being Europe's pawns. To them, an alliance meant submission. Anything less was meaningless. This cultural clash left Europe unsettled. On one hand, the Mongols appeared as the hammer of God, the monsters of apocalypse. On the other, they were sophisticated, pragmatic rulers, willing to engage in diplomacy, trade, and even religious debate. They embodied both barbarity and civilization, and Europe struggled to reconcile the two. Were they demons? Were they potential allies? Or were they simply the future, a power too vast to resist? For peasants, the answer remained simple: fear. But for kings, popes, and merchants, the Mongols became something more complex, a mirror that reflected Europe's own fragility and its smallness in a world far larger than it had imagined. And even as these envoys traveled back and forth, one truth remained unshaken: the Mongols had shown that Europe could be broken. Whether by sword or by diplomacy, the shadow from the east still hung heavy. Though the great storm of 1241 had passed, Europe did not emerge unscarred. The Mongols had withdrawn, but they had not vanished. Their empire still stretched across the steppes, vast and unyielding, and for those who lived nearer to its reach, especially the lands of Rus, the Mongol presence was not a memory but a daily reality. This was the beginning of what history calls the Tatar yoke, the long centuries in which the Golden Horde, the westernmost branch of the Mongol Empire, ruled over the Russian principalities. To the princes of Rus, submission was not a choice but a sentence. Mongol envoys rode into cities demanding tribute, and refusal meant destruction. Towns that defied the horde were burned, their populations enslaved or slaughtered, just as Kyiv had been reduced to ashes. The Khans demanded regular payments of silver and furs, draining the wealth of Rus into their coffers. Yet they allowed the princes to keep their thrones so long as they bowed, kissed the dust before Mongol envoys, and acknowledged the Khan's supremacy. For generations, rulers of Moscow, Vladimir, and other cities traveled to the Horde's capital at Sarai to seek approval for their crowns. The Mongols, though distant, became the invisible masters of the land. This domination reshaped Rus society. The princes who learned to bend to the Horde survived, and some even thrived. Moscow, once a minor town, rose in prominence by becoming a loyal tributary, using Mongol favor to expand its power. In time, this cooperation would lay the foundations for Moscow's eventual dominance over all Rus. But in the 13th century, it meant humiliation. Christian princes kneeling to pagan Khans, their people burdened by taxes, their lands subject to raids whenever payments faltered. For Europe's eastern frontier, the Mongols were not shadows, they were overlords. Farther west, the shadow was subtler but still profound. The Mongols controlled the great trade routes that stretched across Asia, linking Europe to China, Persia, and beyond. Merchants who braved the journey into Mongol lands found both peril and opportunity. Under the Pax Mongolica, caravans traveled more safely than ever before, guarded by the Khan's soldiers, protected by the empire's couriers. Spices, silks, and knowledge flowed westward with an intensity Europe had never known. Yet every transaction was tinged with unease, for these goods came through the hands of those same horsemen who had once burned cities to ash. The fear of return lingered most of all. Europe never forgot how close it had come to destruction. Chroniclers reminded readers that the Mongols had left not from weakness, but from necessity, and that nothing prevented them from returning. Each generation grew up with tales of the invasion, stories of Mohi and Liegnitz, of villages where no rooster crowed. Priests warned that the scourge of God might ride again, this time not to retreat, but to finish the work. Kings, too, ruled in the shadow of the Horde. In Hungary, Bela IV rebuilt his kingdom with stone fortresses, determined that the plains would never again lie open to the steppe. In Poland, alliances were forged with the Teutonic Order to guard against a return. Even in lands untouched by Mongol hooves like France or England, the name Tartar was whispered with dread. Europe's rulers no longer believed themselves untouchable. They knew with bone-deep certainty that beyond the horizon lay a power that could shatter their kingdoms like glass. And yet, the shadow was not entirely dark. Out of this terror came a new awareness of the wider world. Through Mongol lands, maps grew more accurate. Merchants discovered riches beyond imagination, and missionaries glimpsed cultures that defied Europe's narrow vision. The very people who had brought fire and blood also carried the threads of connection that would, in time, pull Europe into a global stage. But in the 13th century, this was not how it felt. To the men and women who lived in villages rebuilt from ashes, or who paid taxes to Khans they had never seen, or who prayed in stone churches against horsemen who might return, the Mongols were not distant traders or curious diplomats. They were the ever-present shadow, the reminder that Christendom's walls were fragile and that the end of days might yet come from the east. The Horde did not need to ride west again to haunt Europe. Their long shadow was enough. The Mongols came like a storm, struck like lightning, and vanished like mist. Yet their impact upon Europe was not erased with their retreat. Instead, the memory of their fury, the terror of their tactics, and the lessons carved into the charred earth of Hungary and Poland endured for centuries. Their legacy was not only of destruction, but of transformation, changing the way Europe thought of itself, its enemies, and its place in the wider world. For the first time, Christendom was forced to confront the reality that it was not the center of history. Until the 13th century, many Europeans had believed their kingdoms, their church, and their knights stood as the mightiest bastions of civilization. But the Mongols shattered that illusion. At Mohi and Liegnitz, knights in shining armor, the very symbol of medieval pride, were broken by horsemen from a land most could not even find on a map. No kingdom was safe, no crown beyond reach. The idea that God favored Christendom above all was shaken to its core. If the Mongols were not merely demons, but men with discipline, genius, and destiny, then Europe was smaller, weaker, and more fragile than it had ever imagined. This realization forced change. Kings began to strengthen their defenses, investing in stone fortresses rather than relying on open battle. Hungary became a fortress kingdom, studded with castles that stood ready for siege. Poland sought alliances with military orders, and even the far-off kingdoms of France and England began to contemplate new strategies for warfare. The Mongols had exposed the weaknesses of feudal levies and chivalric charges, and though Europe clung to its traditions, the seeds of change had been sown. War would never look the same again, yet the Mongols' legacy was not confined to blood and stone. Through them, Europe caught its first real glimpse of the vast world beyond its borders. Envoys returned from Karakorum with stories of cities larger than Paris, roads that stretched across continents, and a civilization that tolerated many faiths under one rule. Merchants who braved the Silk Road under Mongol protection brought back silks, spices, and ideas that would eventually help spark Europe's hunger for exploration. In time, this opening of horizons would lead to the Renaissance, the Age of Discovery, and the forging of global empires. The Mongols, who had come as conquerors, unwittingly became bridges between worlds, and yet the shadow of terror never lifted. In Rus, the Tatar yoke lasted for generations, shaping its princes and altering the trajectory of Russian history. In Central Europe, memories of burnt villages and slaughtered fields were passed down like scars. Even in lands untouched by Mongol hooves, their name remained a byword for fear. Chroniclers wrote of them as if they were not merely men, but a force of nature, an eternal warning that civilization could crumble in a single season. The legacy was paradoxical. The Mongols haunted Europe as destroyers, yet they also connected it to the wider world. They shattered illusions of invincibility, yet planted seeds of resilience. They brought devastation, yet also knowledge. Their armies left behind ashes, but their empire left behind pathways, roads, trade, ideas that would shape Europe's destiny. In the end, the Mongols never returned to complete their conquest of the West. Europe was spared not by its strength, but by fortune, the death of a distant Khan, the vastness of geography, the shifting tides of empire. But for centuries after, every rumor from the steppes, every whisper of riders gathering in the east, rekindled old terrors. The horsemen haunted Europe not in flesh, but in memory. And so the story of the Mongol invasions is not only one of war, but of awakening. For Europe, the thunder of hooves across the plains was a reminder that history was larger than Christendom, that power could come from beyond its borders, and that survival was never guaranteed. The Mongols departed, but their shadow lingered, carved into the soul of a continent. They were conquerors, destroyers, traders, and messengers of a vast world. But above all, to medieval Europe, they remained the storm from the east, an eternal echo of fear that never truly died.